We were just notified that recording is in progress here. We would like to call this meeting of the Provo Municipal Council to order. Today is Tuesday, May 25th, 2021. Time is 3:03 p.m. Meetings of the Municipal Council are now being held in hybrid fashion. Members of the public can continue to view council meetings on YouTube and Facebook, or they may attend in person in the council chamber at the Provo City Center, where there is limited seating available. The mayor, councilors, city staff, and any presenters are participating in the council chamber or by using Zoom webinar. The coronavirus pandemic is not yet over, but vaccines are available now in Utah for everyone 12 and older. We encourage everyone who's eligible to get vaccinated, and we encourage all people to protect themselves and others by following the protocols set by the CDC and our state and local health departments. Please stay safe and be kind. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. We have 6 council members present at the moment, and we'll be joined later by Councillor Bill Fillmore. The opening prayer today will be offered by John Borgett.
Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the opportunity which we have to meet this today to discuss the budget and important financial issues that impact the residents of Provo and the council and administration. We ask that we can have a good discussion and that council will be able to learn and be informed so that they can make important decisions pertaining to the budget and also get their questions answered and get things clear for them. We're so thankful for the opportunity which we have to live and be in such a beautiful city as Provo. We're thankful for our freedom, and we're thankful for the mayor who guides and directs, and the council who commits so much time for the benefit of the residents of Provo. We're thankful for all that we have, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. Please use the raised hand function to indicate that you would like to speak. Please wait to speak until called on by the council chair. First item that we have is approval of minutes. It's proposed that we approve the following minutes from October 20th, 2020 work meeting, November 10th, 2020 work meeting, and the May 18th, 2021 work meeting. Are there any objections or requested changes? Seeing none, I'll declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. Our first item of business is a discussion regarding fiscal year 2022 proposed budget revenues. And this item is to be presented by John Borgett, Administrative Services Director, and David Mortensen, Budget Officer.
Okay. Thank you. And we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of walk through and give you an idea of some of the components that are included in the revenues for the city. And so this first slide shows kind of a breakdown. As you can see, we have, actually, should not be the first slide. Do we have any previous slides? There we go. It's the citywide. Okay, right there. Okay, thank you. So we have almost exactly 300 million, just short of 300 million in citywide budgeted revenues. And the chart on the right does a really good job of showing that 63%, almost 2/3 of the pie is represented by our enterprise funds, which are our business type funds, our utilities. The general fund represents approximately 20%. And so the bulk of the citywide revenues come from those two sources. And then we're gonna go to the next slide and break it down a little bit further. If we want to look at the enterprise funds and see how that portion is broken up, we can see that it's primarily energy, which is 40% of the pie, wastewater, which is 28%, and water, which is 25%. And so the lion's share of the enterprise fund budget revenues come from those three areas. And you can see that we do have the golf course, the peak, sanitation, utility, and the airport, but just understand that most of the revenue is coming from those three. We go to the next slide and we can see on general fund, the bulk of the general fund revenues are coming from sales tax. Sales tax represents 39%, almost 40% of the pie. And then we have franchise fees that are 18%. And then we have our user fees, which are like rec center fees and other fees for services that are 19%. And then the third is property tax at 10%. And so just kind of gives you a flavor of how that makeup is. We go to the next slide. For the year, we had an increase in budgeted revenues of about $18.7 million. Most of that increase comes from the enterprise fund. You see 65% comes from the enterprise funds, and 26% of that increase comes from the general fund. So once again, those are the primary sources that are providing the increase in budgeted revenues. We go to the next slide. This shows of the different components what makes up the increase for the enterprise funds. And one of the things that's a little bit glaring is the brown piece, which represents 42%. That's actually a decrease in budgeted revenues. You can see that the airport was down $34,220,000. And you might say, well, what happened there? Well, what happened was last year, we budgeted $34 million for grants and federal assistance for the airport terminal. And so it was kind of a one-time budget so that we could plan on that money and we could get started on the airport terminal. And so that drops at $34 million. Well, if you look at water is up $30,741,000. Okay, and that's representative of the 37% over on the right of the graph. And the reason it's up so dramatically is that we are actually budgeting in this year's budget a $30 million grant for a potential water treatment plant. And so that's a big piece of the pie for the enterprise funds as well as for the city. Also, you can see with wastewater, we're up 15 million. Of that 15, 13 million of that is an expected draw on a loan from the state for work on the water treatment plant. And so if you look at that, all those big items that are so significant on either increases or decreases are all related to funding of capital assets, okay? And so it's important to just kind of get a flavor of that and of what that makes up.
Morgan, we have a question from Councilor.
Sure.
I raised my hand earlier. I wanted to ask about, it surprised me a little bit that our revenue from wastewater was greater than our revenue from water. But I actually am kind of glad that you went on because I can see that a lot of these numbers are due at the point that you're making are due to grants, both new grants that we didn't have last year that are showing a large increase, or grants that we had last year that we won't have this year which gives us a pretty large decrease. And it just makes me wonder now at this point, it just makes me wonder how helpful it is to be looking at and comparing year to year with these grants in it, or maybe if it would be good to look at it both with and without the impacts of the grants. But you basically already answered the question I had.
Well, I appreciate that, Councilman Harding. One of the reasons I think this is so important is that a lot of times there's a kind of a sense that, oh, we had an increase in revenues and we can go out and what can we spend with that increase? Can we pay for vital services? Can we fund additional officers? I mean, it's important to understand that the city is a very diverse entity with a lot of different types of operations, and so it's helpful to kind of know and understand how it breaks out, what's included in those increases, so that we can actually evaluate and make good decisions. Okay, if we go to the next slide, this is a significant slide because this is looking at the general fund and what makes up the general fund increase. Almost 70% is sales tax. Okay, a huge piece of the pie, and we're going to talk a little bit more about sales tax in a minute, but it just shows that right now a lot of what we're able to do and fund in the general fund this year is the result of this dramatic increase in sales tax revenue. Also, some other pieces, franchise fees up about 426,000. Fees, user fees, which primarily comes from the rec center and other areas where we're starting to see business coming back as a result of post-COVID. So that's a positive. And then the next one is property tax, which is about 6%. And so that's kind of helpful to see, but the big piece is sales tax. And so the next thing we want to talk about is sales tax. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a very helpful graph because it shows how sales tax has been trending since 2018. And the blue lines are budget numbers. The green are actual. And so you can see that, first of all, there's a general trend towards things moving up. You can also see that in the past, in every one of these years, our actual revenues have exceeded the budgeted revenue. You can also see that in fiscal 2020 and also fiscal 2021, we actually budgeted at the same level. And as we remember from last year, we did that because we wanted to be conservative and we were concerned about the impacts of COVID. And so therefore we held back on our budgeted revenue. So the next, over in the 2021 projected number, I would mention that we just received our sales tax distribution for March. So we now have 9 months of actual data and 3 months still to go ahead. We have April, which is almost done, but we don't know what the results are for that right now, as well as May and June. But if we were to stay on the same trend that we're on right now, we would hit 22,867,237. Okay. And then the amount that we currently have budgeted in fiscal 22 is about $1 million more than what we're projected to be at the end of this year. Okay. And so that gives you a little flavor. And then the next slide is helpful because it shows what our percentage increases have been for each year. And you can see that in 2017, we were a little over 5. 2018, we were a little under 6%. 2019, we were about 2.8 or 2.6%. And then 20, we're about 5, a little over 5. And then right now, based on 9 months of data, we're projected to be about 10.4%. Okay. And then right now for 2022, on top of that, assuming that we get the 10.4, we are budgeting for about a little over a 4% increase. And I would just mention that it kind of has two things that we're contingent upon. Number one, whether we're going to reach our current projection or not, that's an unknown. And then what we're going to reach on top of that. I would mention that in past years, we have been more conservative in this, but due to the fact that we wanted to be a little bit more optimistic than we've been in the past, we wanted to really try to, the administration wanted to focus on the council's priorities as well as administration's priorities as far as bringing things back to post-COVID. Also trying to take care of our employees so that we can value them and take care of them, as well as some of the other priorities that were identified by the council. Do I feel comfortable with our current budget? I do. I don't think it's going to be very likely that we're going to be significantly over that number, but we could. The other thing that's unknown too is, as we've seen the stimulus payments that have gone out, I think part of that large increase in 2021 is likely from those stimulus payments. And it's a little unknown whether that's going to continue to benefit into 2022 or whether or not we're going to level out a little bit. But that's kind of where we are on sales tax. Any questions on, I know it's a big, important item that the council's had a number of questions on as we talk about sales tax increases and what our methodology is and where we're at. Any questions?
Councilor Shipley?
Yeah, I just wondered, based on this chart we're looking at right now, what was the 21 budgeted percentage increase? So you've got the projected based on 21, but what was the 21 budgeted?
Okay. If you go back to the previous slide, that's actually that's the same level. It was in 19,850.
So we projected a 0% increase.
We actually projected a decrease because our number ended up being 20,675,621, and we budgeted 19,850 because we were concerned about COVID, and we didn't know what the year-end number was going to be either at that point, but we still were budgeting lower than what we projected because of COVID.
So you estimate at this point, based on 9 months, that we'll be about 10% over our budgeted amount for 21.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we're estimating on top of that about 4.1%. We're going to come in over and above that as well for the new year. Does that make sense?
For the 22. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Hanley?
John, I don't know if this is a helpful question or not. I'm not quite sure how to frame it, but we get asked a lot about sales tax revenue and how are we doing in the city to increase it. And, with some of our shopping malls and so on in state of idleness or transition, and there's a general sense that we're way behind where we should be. I'm just wondering if you have some way of assessing that for us, either in terms of the total amount of 22 million coming from sales tax. I mean, how does that compare with neighboring cities, or in terms of the percentage of our budget coming from sales revenue? How do we compare with comparable cities?
Well, I would share a couple things. For you and others to know, the way that it works in the state of Utah is the distribution is based 50% on population and 50% on actual point of sale. And so that's the formula that we get. I would mention that, and I was going to ask you to pull this up, and maybe what I'll do in a minute as David's talking on the latter portion, I will pull it up and tell you exactly where the state is at. But, we're up about 10.4% year to date. The state is higher than that. And I'll share with you the number. But as we compare Provo with like some of the other areas in Utah County, particularly the areas that are high growth, like Lehigh and even Pleasant Grove and Spanish Fork, that has some pretty significant growth going on, both from a residential perspective as well as a retail, that we are not running as high as a percentage increase as they are. But the state of Utah's overall economy has weathered COVID much better than most, almost than all. And we're part of that. You know, we're that 50% portion that's based on population really helps. And so I would just say we're still in really good shape. The other thing that was really helping Provo is that the online collection of sales tax has gone up astronomically. And so that has been a huge positive impact for Provo as well. If we had all kinds of new retail centers popping up and whatnot, would we be up more? Yes, but I would still say that we are in a really good position based on the fact that we're in the state of Utah and our online sales are strong, and overall Provo is healthy.
Do you have a sense of how much online accounts for the tax revenues?
Well, we see those, and once again, it's confidential information. I would just mention that our online sales is our number one property tax collector right now, which is amazing. We've seen it come up over the last year to where it was like number 30, number 10, number 5, number 5. It is our number one source right now, and so it's having a significant impact on Provo. As far as specifically what that impact is, I'm not prepared to share that, but I can just let you know that it's a significant influence.
Mr. Harding?
Yeah, that was pretty close to my question. So I just wanted to confirm. So the number one sales tax, portion of our sales tax comes from online. Is that?
Yep. Yep. That just happened a few months ago. It's been growing and growing, but it just occurred. So. Okay.
And thank you. And I appreciate what you said, where, previously it used to be almost insignificant, and now it's grown to be number one. And that has been happening, I think, almost in this time that is up on the screen right now on this slide. And so I think more and more that 50-50 formula for distribution of sales tax has become less important, because point of sales is becoming people's living room rather than the showroom.
Yep, that's correct. Any other questions? Okay, I am going to hold on 1 second. I can have this for you in just about a second here. I will have it right. Okay, so if we look at the state year to date is actually up 13.9%, 4% as a whole, and we are up 10.6%. And so not as much as the state as a whole, but still very healthy, and has put us in a really good position through 9 months. Okay, I will turn the time over to David then to walk through some of the other revenues.
Okay, thanks, John. John Magnus, can we bring the presentation back up? Thank you. So on the following slides, we just wanted to kind of give a similar visual on other tax types that are related to the general fund. So these graphs will look similar to the sales tax graph that you saw, where blue will be the budgeted numbers and green is the actual numbers. So this slide is showing a visual for wrap tax revenue from fiscal year 18 through what we're proposing for fiscal year 22. Wrap tax, because it is a transaction tax similar to sales tax, has been following a similar trend. You can see an upward trend in our actuals year over year. And on the next slide, Thanks, John. Here you can see a similar trend in the percentage increases as well, with a fairly significant increase in projected for 2021 and a similar proposed budget for 2022 of about a 4% increase over what we budgeted last year. John, if you can go to the next slide. So this visual is for property tax revenues. You can see also an upward trend, but not as quickly upward as sales tax. Property taxes tend to stay somewhat level just based on the formula that is used to calculate property taxes. As you've heard before, if values go up in the county or in the city, then our rate actually goes down, keeping our revenues somewhat level. The increases that we see from year to year are based on mostly any population growth or commercial growth. We can see some upward trends there. So you can see here, we typically budget about 2.5% increase from the prior year's projected amount. So that's what we're showing here is the projected amount of 5.7 million for fiscal year 21, and then a proposed budget of 5.9 million. One thing to keep in mind with property tax as well is that the county assessor does their own calculation of what our revenues will be. And we actually rely on that number. So this 5.9 million that we have now is kind of our estimate until we get that certified tax rate, along with the assessor's estimate of our expected revenues. And then we typically will replace this number with that number when we get it. That typically happens late May or sometimes first week of June. So sometime in the next few days, we should have that information and have an update to our property tax number. Next slide. This slide shows franchise fee revenues. This is another significant revenue source for the general fund. This includes franchise fees for our own Provo utilities, as well as third-party utilities such as natural gas, cable companies, cell phone companies, various other franchises. You can see also an upward trend, mostly in our actuals. And our budget, we typically have tried to budget kind of right in line with the trends. You can see there's a few years where we're a little bit off on our budget, but we feel like this year's proposed budget for fiscal year 22 of 10.8 million is optimistic. We're planning on some growth here, primarily because of our city utilities and some rate changes there that will help to increase that. But we don't feel like we can go much higher than that in franchise fee revenues. Next slide. This shows our B and C roads revenues that we received from the state, fairly level through the last 3 or 4 years, hovering right around 4 million. So we've just kept that budget level right around that amount. So not a whole lot of flexibility to move up or down there. And next slide. So this is our fees revenue. As John mentioned earlier in the presentation, fees includes primarily our parks and recreation fees, cemetery fees, some of our community and neighborhood services and development service fees like building permits, plan checking, things like that all go into this. You can kind of see kind of the up and down of this trend, especially going from 2019 to 2020. You can see the impact that COVID had on our fee revenues right there as our actuals in 2019 being 9.7 million and our actuals in 2020 being 8.8 million. And that primarily would be the impact to our rec center and other recreation activities that we couldn't hold during the initial months of COVID. We are showing in 21 that is turning around. The rec center, from what we hear, is just as busy as ever. And so we're projecting to come in not quite to our budget level, but close. And then our proposed budget for 22, we're expecting even more growth to come back to where we probably would have been had COVID not happened.
Mr. Hardy?
Obviously, hindsight is 2020. We're not quite in hindsight because it's still projected, but we have 9 months of data. I think it's interesting that we were very concerned, and I was part of the group that passed the budget, but we were very concerned about sales tax and the impact that the pandemic would have on sales tax, and we ended up having kind of a record year. Yet I guess we didn't revise down our budget for our fees, and that actually did get hit pretty hard by the pandemic. So anyway, it was just an interesting note.
Yeah, and we recognize that too, that, as far as our recreation fees, we probably should have been more conservative with those in response to COVID. The good news is that, it performed even better than we could have imagined. And we're coming, close to what that budget was. But like I said, we're anticipating things to just keep getting better, especially as COVID kind of is waning, and really plan on seeing some good things in parks and recreation. So next slide. So this shows all of our other revenues in the general fund. This one, as you can imagine, is the hardest one to predict, the hardest one to project and budget for. It includes basically everything else that doesn't fall into any of the categories that we previously mentioned. One of the things that kind of throws this one off every year is intergovernmental revenues. So some of those large swings that you can see between what we budget and what actually happens is due to grant revenues that we receive. So we don't necessarily know at the beginning of the year all of the federal grants or state grants that we are going to be applying for or be awarded. So we typically don't budget for those, but we come to the council with the appropriation requests when we receive grants for things. The largest column there, you can see actuals in fiscal year 2020, that $10 million of revenue, just under 6 million of that is CARES Act grant revenue. And then the 4.3 million projected amount for fiscal year 21 includes about $2.5 million of CARES grant revenues. And then fiscal year 22, that budget amount does include some of the ARPA fund revenues. And on the next slide, I show some information that will kind of detail that. So as far as ARPA revenues, we've been receiving more information from the Treasury about permitted uses of the revenues of the funds. One thing that we did early on in the budget process, as we were, ARPA was passed by the legislature, and we were anticipating some funds coming our way. And we were hearing word that one of the allowable uses would be lost revenues. And that's, as we just saw in Parks and Rec, was one of the biggest impacts to us from COVID is revenues lost in those recreation type fees. So one of the things, a couple of other places that were impacted in the city from COVID and fees was our lodging taxes. People weren't going out and traveling and staying in hotels. So our lodging taxes revenues suffered. And then the Justice Court couldn't really do much at all. And so our Justice Court revenues dropped significantly. So when we were in the beginning stages of preparing the fiscal year 22 budget, we saw that lost revenues were an allowable use for ARPA funds. And so we were planning on just about 440,000 of ARPA funds to make up some of the difference, some of the shortfall in those lodging taxes and Justice Court fees. And as we're receiving more guidance from Treasury and looking at their FAQs, we're learning that the lost revenue calculation that they're allowing is quite a bit different than what we were anticipating. Basically, we're not able to look at individual revenue sources and calculate that lost revenue on an individual department basis, but we're instead required to look at the aggregate amount for the city as a whole and see what those revenue trends have been. And if our overall revenues have dropped because of COVID, then we could potentially use ARPA funds to make up some of that difference. And there's a kind of complicated formula that they would have us use to calculate what we could use from ARPA funds for that purpose. And then those funds would also have to be used for specific purposes. We couldn't just save it away and put it in a savings account or a rainy day fund. They'd have to be spent within the budget year, I believe, on government purposes. So because of that, it kind of complicated what we were planning in the budget. But we did find an allowable use that did enable us to utilize some of the ARPA revenues in this budget initially, and while we're still evaluating some other ideas and potential uses of the remainder of the ARPA revenues. So one of the things that is allowable by ARPA funds is the reinstatement of positions that were lost due to COVID. So as you know, last year in the budget process, there were a number of positions that went unfunded as a response to COVID. Some of those include 2 full-time engineers, 2 full-time economic development management analysts, 2 code compliance officers, a recreation program coordinator, and a couple of part-time positions. So in our budget, before we found out about the lost revenue complications, we had already included in the budget this top group of positions, including 2 full-time engineers, 1 of the full-time economic development management analyst positions, 1.5 code compliance officers. One would start in July, the other would start in January. That's why there's a 1.5 there. And then the Parks Recreation Program Coordinator. So those had already been included in the budget. Those total up to about $481,000 in cost to reinstate those positions in the fiscal year 22 budget. So that's what in our revised numbers we are proposing. We use ARPA funds to fund that $481,000. There's also some positions that we had not included in the budget up to this point that we could potentially utilize ARPA funds to add into the budget, and that's the other economic development management analyst, the other half of year for code compliance officer, and then a part-time IS technician. I would just mention that we are somewhat hesitant to add any additional positions using these funds because they are not ongoing funds. The ARPA funds are allowable for up to 3 years through 2024. So if the more positions we fund with this revenue, we would need to make sure we plan for after 2024 how we're going to continue to pay for those positions. So that's our only concern there. And as of now, those positions are not included in the budget, but the top positions, the 481,000, are included in the budget. Another thing that we've included is revenues to cover public safety behavioral health services. So this is a supplemental request that came in kind of recently. I think it came in since the last time we met even. And this is, you'll remember that the fire department came to the council a few months ago and asked for an appropriation, portion of which would cover this professional services for behavioral health. And that appropriation was granted, was approved by the council. This would be continuing that for another year. And there's a specific area within the ARPA fund guidelines that allows for the use of public safety behavioral health. So we feel like it's a good use and an opportunity to pay for that service with some of these funds. So with that, I believe that's the end of our presentation, and John and I are happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Mr. Strachan.
So John and David, when we talked yesterday, we talked about one of the reasons why we asked for this particular discussion was to identify whether or not there would be any additional funds that could be either projected, if we were a little less conservative or squeezed out or whatever. Will you give the summary of kind of that discussion about where we were left at the end of trying to identify if there was more available to cover some of the supplementals?
David, I'll step up, and then if you want to add anything, you can.
Okay.
We kind of tried to mention it when we were talking about the revenues, but my feeling is that we've been, pretty aggressive in our budgeted revenues. I feel good about them. I don't think it's likely we're going to exceed, particularly like with sales tax. I feel like it's a good, reasonable goal, and I think there's a good chance they'll reach it. But do I think we're going to go significantly over it? I don't believe so. Is there a chance that we maybe will be slightly under it? I think it definitely could be. But I feel like we've already been somewhat aggressive. We also went back and looked at some of the other revenues. We wanted to make sure that we could reach, look at the council's, priorities and really try to do the things that the administration wanted to do. And so I feel like we've already kind of done that. I feel like if we were to go back and even be more aggressive, it would put us in a situation that I don't think we really want to be in. And so I'm comfortable. The only area that I could really see that we could utilize is what David just mentioned with the other positions that could be funded with the ARPA money. But as he mentioned, it is a little bit of a slippery slope because the funding would end in 2024, and then it's like an ongoing expense with a limited supply of revenue. But that is an option. But that's kind of my take on it. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think right now we're where we should be, and I'd be a little uncomfortable going further or trying to do more with increasing our budgeted revenues.
Mr. Harding?
Thank you. This is a bit more specific of a question, and I actually don't need an answer right now in this meeting, but it just struck me that our revenue from wastewater is greater than that for our regular water. And then if I followed the presentation correctly, much of that now I'm second guessing myself, but even if we take out the grants, it still seemed like the revenues from wastewater are greater than the revenues from water. And I was just curious, is that typical for cities? I know that we've had to be fairly aggressive with our wastewater in order to fund the new treatment plant, but is that typical for in the history of Provo that we've generally paid more for wastewater than for water? And is that typical of other cities around the state and around the country?
I would have to do a little bit of research. I'm going to go in and David or we can spend a minute here and let you know specifically if we pull grants out, if wastewater is up. I think it is slightly higher than the water budget now for just regular utility revenues. But as far as whether that's unique or whether we're different, we'd probably need to go back and check on that unless Wayne knows. I don't know, but I do know that as a result of the size of the wastewater treatment plant and the scale of it and what's needed to be able to meet the needs of the residents, those kind of significant dollars going into that infrastructure does have an impact on rates. David, could you check?
Yeah,
David,
I'm looking at it. Yep, I'm looking at it right now. So our proposed budget, if you just look at the utility sales and take out any other types of revenues, our water fund proposed revenues for water sales is just under 16 million, and wastewater sales is about 23 million. And that 23 million is about a $2 million increase over last year due to a rate increase of 15%. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But yes, our current structure is showing that our wastewater fund does bring in more revenues than our water fund.
Mr. Parker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's fair to say that historically it's not been this way, that water has been a higher revenue generator than wastewater. Those lines crossed operationally 2 or 3 years ago. And I think, again, as I talk to my colleagues around the country, this is not at all uncommon, particularly as EPA standards and state standards have increased on wastewater, and we're being required to do more and more treatment of wastewater in order, again, to be sensitive to the environmental concerns that we have. I think lots and lots of cities are finding themselves in the point where their lines have crossed. It's not at all uncommon.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? All right, thank you. That was a really helpful presentation, and I'm convinced that we're being, I don't know if you want to say more aggressive or less pessimistic about revenue growth this year. So thank you for clarifying that. Let's move on to item number 2, and we'd like to welcome Councilor Bill Fillmore and Mayor Kafusi, who've joined us during this last item. Item number 2 is a discussion regarding fiscal year 2022 budget supplemental request for additional parking enforcement personnel. And this item is to be presented by David Mortensen, Budget Officer.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. I hope you guys don't get sick of hearing me talk today. I've got a few things on here. So in a previous work meeting, the council had asked finance to take an independent look at an analysis that was done by our parking enforcement staff in regards to their supplemental request to add 2 parking enforcement officers and an office specialist. So we took a look at it, got information from them about how they calculated things. And there are a couple of things that we did differently in our analysis, and I'll point those out. So first, I wanted to talk about the revenue calculation, how this amount of $126,000 per officer was calculated. So what was done is we have 1 full-time officer currently. And so we looked at the last 3 years of history for that 1 officer and how many tickets on average were issued by that 1 officer. From that total number of tickets, they looked at how many of those tickets went paid, how many were unpaid, how many were just warnings, voids, dismissals, things like that. Of that, 3,152 tickets on average over the last 3 years ended up being paid by the individual that received the ticket. The average, sorry, not the average, but the amount of a parking ticket is $55, but there's a $15 reduction in that price if it's paid within the first 7 days. And then after 14 days unpaid, there's an additional charge that brings the total cost up to $68.75. So in this calculation of potential revenue, taking a conservative approach, $40 per ticket was used. So that's assuming that people pay within the first 7 days and don't wait until after that. I feel like that's a good approach to take, being conservative with our revenue projection. So we feel good about that number. What we wanted to add, though, is something that would take into account the law of diminishing returns, because we understand that we can't indefinitely add more parking enforcement officers and still expect the same output. Just like in any business production, you can't expect the exact same output just because you add 1 additional resource. There's some form of diminishing returns there. It's a little bit hard to pin down because we really don't know definitively what the maximum what the upper limit is as far as parking violations in the city is. We don't really have a way to quantify that. And we also have to take into consideration, just from a policy standpoint and a political standpoint, what that maximum looks like, what the council and administration is comfortable with enforcing, basically. So what we added to our analysis was a revenue factor. Basically, we're saying that the first additional parking enforcement officer would bring in 90% of the revenue that the current officer that we have would bring in. And then the second one, we take off another 10%. So they would bring in 80% of the revenue that our current officer is bringing in. So after taking into account those factors, our estimated impact for revenues, we're showing there a total for both positions of $214,336. There's another slight difference that we made with the parking staff on the salary costs. Their estimate was based on entry level step 1 for a new hire. We typically, when we budget, will budget vacant positions at a step 7. That is just to be conservative, and in case we find a candidate that warrants starting at a higher step, we just feel like in this analysis that it was wiser to use the calculation of mid-range starting pay. So that's what those numbers there reflect. So you can see the salary costs, the benefit costs, the equipment costs are the same as what was presented by our parking enforcement personnel. And then we talked to them about, one of our concerns was in regard to vehicles, because obviously these positions would need to be able to get around the city to perform their job and to issue these citations. We were assured by the parking staff that we have sufficient vehicles and license plate readers and that type of equipment that is needed for these 2 additional positions. In the future, that we may need to reevaluate, that vehicle count, but they feel like they have enough for these 2 positions to be able to do their work. So we didn't add anything for vehicle costs. So you can see the final column there, estimated net impact when you take into account the estimated revenue minus the costs. We do project that each of those positions would bring some net revenue into the city. One thing that was a recommendation of administration to add a little bit more cushion would be to hire the office specialist as a part-time position rather than a full-time position. If that was a full-time position, it basically would take up all of that net income. So we would be right there at a break even, and there's really no room for any error. But with a part-time position, it does leave just under $50,000 of additional revenue as a kind of a cushion if our revenue projections come in lower than we were expected, or for some reason equipment costs or other costs came in higher. So in the end, that's kind of our take on it, and our analysis is we do feel like there's obviously up to the council and whether they are going to prioritize parking enforcement and would like these 2 additional positions. If that is something that's wanted by the council, we feel like the revenues could cover the cost of it. So with that, I will take any questions that you might have.
Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but I would be supportive of potentially one officer and the part-time position, the staff position as well. I have a hard time making the assumption that the diminishing returns are 10%. I have no idea. I'm trying to get my mind around, do we have that many more tickets to write in Provo? And if we do, what kind of blowback is going to happen if we're writing a ticket the second anybody violates anything in our entire city? And if we do that, and maybe that's a good outcome, 6 months later, when everybody thinks, hey, I'm going to get a ticket the moment I break the law in Provo parking, then all of a sudden we have compliance and these 3 folks can't write the tickets that we had initially expected. So there's just some, as you were speaking, I'm thinking, okay, first, I don't know if I want the complaints about additional officers to, and we're going to get some, right? There's going to be some of that, and we want additional compliance. So that's not the worst thing in the world. I just don't know how fast we want to go down that road. But then secondly, if we go down it really fast, maybe the unintended consequence is that the revenue doesn't happen because we get compliance, right? And that's not a horrible thing, but all of a sudden the revenue's not there to offset what we thought we were going to offset. So I'm thinking out loud here, but my thought process is maybe the one officer, maybe the staff, and maybe we look at it in 6 months and we say, okay, how did it go so far? Maybe it's 9 months or 12 months down the road. How did it go so far? What was the feedback? Do we have additional compliance? Because that's really the outcome that we're trying for here. And were they as revenue neutral as we thought they would be? instead of going to the two positions. So that's just my thought.
Mr. Harding.
I'd love to second everything that Mr. Shipley just said. I think that's, I also am concerned that, to say that even that, and I appreciate the diminishing revenue, is a slightly more conservative approach, but still that almost is the assumption that there's the number of tickets that are being written is not nowhere close to the number of violations that are currently occurring, and that just by adding more bandwidth to write tickets, would it was well stated. I do think that's interesting about the concept about the blowback. At least the constituents that talk to me are ones that aren't. Every once in a while I hear some complaints about, oh, well, I got a ticket and I disagree that, it shouldn't have been a parking ticket, or I parked here a ton of times and all of a sudden now I got a ticket and I never had one before. But by far the constituents that talk to me with complaints about parking are generally that parking enforcement is not occurring, up to what they would hope to see. And so I do think, I'm sure we will get some blowback, but we may actually get a lot of people that are just very grateful that they're seeing more enforcement. I also want to echo and just put an exclamation point on the fact that we're not looking for revenue. We are not looking for tickets to be written. We're looking for that compliance, and it might be a little difficult to reduce FTEs or whatever in the future if that's what it comes to. But that really would be a great thing if we can have such great compliance that it doesn't justify having any more enforcement officers, and we can deal with that difficulty in the future. But that I really think is the goal. I'll throw in a plug, and I think that I like your approach as well that you suggested of just taking things a little bit slow. I think that's I'm glad that we're making progress, but I'm not afraid of incremental progress, and I think that's the case as well when we talked about potentially looking at enterprise funds for this as well, and I'm okay holding off a little bit on that, but where we're estimating, well, we know this is how many tickets are written, and if we apply $40 per ticket to that, I think that if we had, maybe I don't understand them, but I think if we had like an enterprise fund, we wouldn't have to be estimating these things. We would actually know, like, hey, this is the amount of revenue that was brought in on this line item, and this is the cost of providing the enforcement that brought in that revenue. And so this does seem like something that might lend itself very well to a revenue fund, and then it keeps the accounting and it helps us understand what the cost of providing that service is and how that's offset by the revenues that are brought in. So thank you.
Mr. Mortensen.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on part of what Councilman Harding mentioned about enterprise funds. We have been looking into that as well to see kind of what the possibilities are. One thing that concerns us is we rely heavily on GAAP, as you know, generally accepted accounting principles, and the information that we've found so far, basically the definition of an enterprise fund states that funds that may be used to report any activity for which a fee is charged to external users for goods or services. So our concern here is that there's not, if it's primarily the revenue source is government imposed non-exchange type transactions, that's not really a good or service that we are providing. And most of the cities, I looked into a few cities that do have parking enterprise funds, and they primarily have a large number of either garages or parking lots, or they have meters that they track where they're collecting that revenue as a service for providing the parking spot. So that I would just mention that we have some concerns with that aspect of it, if we're relying on the revenues of just those fines and citations.
Mr. Borget.
Yeah, my other concern, I could be wrong, but my sense would be with an enterprise fund, there would be more focus on revenues, particularly revenues to cover the costs, and not sure that's the outcome we would want either.
I had a question about the current composition of the parking enforcement department. If I'm remembering right, there's currently one full-time enforcement officer and something like 4 or 5 part-time officers. Is that, can
Yes.
someone confirm that?
Yes. That is correct.
Is it 4 or 5? I'm just curious, part-time.
Well, we have a fund of money and for part-time help. And we've had 6 part-time people before. And currently, Sandy, are we at 4 or 5 right now? Can't remember. I think it's 4. And so that number fluctuates. Since they are part-time, people quit. The good thing about full-time is it gives us more flexibility. You know, we're hoping to have, right now, the full-time position really works the graveyard shift. What we're hoping to do is take another full-time position, be able to use it in more strategic areas. We will still have part-time people. So those part-time people will share vehicles, do different areas of emphasis, and be able to do things. And our goal is compliance, not going out to write the maximum amount of tickets that we possibly can, because we're not doing that right now. We don't want to do that. We don't want to be perceived as it's just a revenue scheme for the city. We're trying to target areas where when we're doing enforcement, it's making a difference in the quality of life that people have in that area. And so we will still have a pool of money by which we can hire part-time people. We'll continue to do that. Now, admittedly, if we are getting things done with our full-time people and don't need as many part-time people, and we have much greater turnover in part-time than we do full-time. And if we don't need them, then we can adjust that up and down. But if we need that pool, we can hire people on a part-time basis to come in. So right now it's 1 and I believe 5 part-time officers. It may have dropped to 4. I can't quite remember. But we've had enough of a budget to have up to 6 full part-time enforcement people.
Thank you. That was actually one of the advantages I saw of this proposal is I think migrating toward more full-time officers and presumably less part-time at some point would bring additional stability, additional expertise, I think an overall increase in effectiveness as opposed to continually going through this turnover cycle of hiring and training. So,
and Sandy spends a tremendous amount of her time hiring, training. People leave. Sometimes people want to leave for weeks or months at a time and to come back, and we have to make the cost-benefit analysis. Is it better to just hire, or we have a gap in our enforcement for several weeks or months while we try and deal with these things? Whereas full-time will give us that stability in strategic time slots to be able to really get out and be effective.
thank you. So my thought would be to migrate sooner rather than later. Maybe we only start with 1 at first, although I'm comfortable starting with 2. Especially since there doesn't appear to be any likely negative impact on revenues. Of course, there is some uncertainty about that. Another approach might be we hire 1 initially, and then as part-time people turn over, like they inevitably will, then replace a couple with a full-time position. Any other questions or comments on this item? Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, I would prefer obviously to go one at a time, like I've mentioned. Even if it was 6 months from now, I know that we're in a budget process, but I would be willing to look at it in 6 months and evaluate. The one thing, as you were talking about, replacing part-timers with full-time, I get that but I think the reason that this even came up as a proposal is because it was going to be revenue neutral to add these additional officers. And so if the priority is to replace part-timers with full-time, I can see, the benefit of that, but that's additional cost, right? Because their benefits cost is fully accretive. It's not something that we had before. So I guess now I'm kind of confused because I was kind of looking at it as the reason we got this proposal a few weeks ago was because it was a revenue neutral proposal. If we're going to replace or try to migrate from part-timers to full-timers, I don't think that's revenue neutral. And I think that's a different, just a different conversation, different priority.
All right. Thank you very much. Oh, Mr. Harding, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's getting a little bit cloudier. I did want to mention, just talking about kind of that revenue neutral aspect, and the enterprise fund aspect. I do think, if we do go with a more proactive parking management program, and maybe we are helping to manage, or we are managing, some of these garages or whatever, or the electronic on-street parking metering, basically. I think we may get to the point where it makes sense to do an enterprise fund, perhaps just in how we account for the revenues and whatnot. I don't know if we have flexibility in maybe doing that at more detail, so we can justify, or we can verify these claims or thoughts that this could be a revenue neutral endeavor. That would be helpful. And I just generally taking a step back from this particular item, if we're talking about the rec center, if we're looking at a program that adding a park, and that's going to add whatever $200,000 each additional year for maintenance, where that's $200 that doesn't get offset by anything, versus expanding the adult sports program, but the adult sports program pays for itself, and predict that it's pretty likely that even if we expand it, it'll still pay for itself. To me, those are two very different questions about that $200,000, and it's if it's a potentially revenue neutral item. I really liked the idea of going forward a little bit slower, maybe revisiting, basically adding a full-time now and revisiting in 6 months, or once it's up and running, that we're still tracking on having this new revenue neutral. But I'm also wondering if we are looking at maybe shifting some part-time to full-time, but then also perhaps adding one additional full-time officer, enforcement officer, parking enforcement officer. If the cost is roughly that of adding one. Anyway, so that's actually, I think, what I would be most interested in at this point, or at least interested in considering adding one full-time officer to increase our enforcement bandwidth, and with the hopeful potential significant increase in the revenue from the tickets, but then also shifting some of those part-time to full-time for the other reasons that we've discussed, plus a part-time support staff, and then revisiting in 6 months and checking kind of our assumptions that this is going to be fairly revenue neutral.
Mr. Strachan?
Question for you then is your proposal then to seek to put the full funding in the budget or to put in partial funding now for one position and then do a new appropriation in January. Because you could put the money in the budget to do it with the intent that, and with the stated intent that you don't actually trigger the second unless the numbers are warranted.
I guess I'm kind of looking for a motion at this point. Mr. McGinn, let's hear from you first.
I just wanted to reiterate the reason we brought forward the proposal, and we do believe it's revenue neutral, is because right now with one full-time officer and up to 6 part-time officers, we're at capacity with doing enforcement, and we get more requests and feedback from areas of the city that want and say they need enforcement, but we just don't have the bandwidth to do it. And so as we looked at it, we thought that we would have the possibility of 2 full-time people. And part-time we don't like for a lot of reasons that we've already discussed here. And so we thought that the demand for enforcement, without seeming to be a revenue raising activity for the city, that we could support too. A go slow approach makes a lot of sense, to come in and have one full-time person now, and then see how that impacts the number of tickets or revenue, and if we're making a difference out in the neighborhoods. And we'll also see, more likely than not, the effect on the part-time people. Do we have a need? Where are they going? Because one full-time person is more effective, frankly, than 2 part-time people, because they're not gearing up every day and then twice a day, gearing up and then gearing down twice a day. They gear up once, they gear down once. There's consistency in what they're doing. And so that could be something we could come back with an analysis in 6 months to see if the council's getting what they bargained for by going this route.
Anyone prepared to make a motion? Councilor Ellsworth?
Sorry, I'm not prepared to make a motion. My question is how will we measure the outcomes that we want? That's all. That's my question.
I can measure the revenue. I can measure the amount of tickets for you, kind of the quantitative aspect to it. The qualitative of whether we're really making a difference in neighborhoods, that's hard to put numbers around. That's more of are people calling up and complaining. And right now, people are calling us and complaining and wanting enforcement done in areas and at times that I just don't have the capacity to go and enforce in those areas at those times.
Mr. Shipley?
Yeah, I don't, Cliff, you're going to have to help me with wording on this. So I'm happy to do a motion, but I don't know exactly what it's supposed to sound like. The idea of having us move forward or encourage the administration to move forward in the proposed budget for next year to fund 1 additional enforcement officer plus the part-time staff at this point, with the idea that we evaluate in 6 months and potentially trigger a second full-time staff if it's working effectively. We can look at the qualitative data, but also I'm interested, to Shannon's point, and Gary, I think, Mr. McGinn, I think we can look at and have a sense of the non-qualitative part too, right? I mean, you know, the complaint volume is something we can have a sense of, I think. And so if we've made some progress on that front and the qualitative data checks out, then I would say that we could trigger that second one as well.
We have a motion by Mr. Shipley. Mr. Harding?
I'd be happy to second that.
Second by Mr. Harding. Is there any discussion on the motion? Anyone need clarification? Okay, it seemed pretty clear to me. If there is no other discussion on the motion, I'll call for a vote. Counselor Hoban,
Yes.
Counselor Fillmore,
Yes.
Counselor Ellsworth,
Yes.
Counselor Harding,
Yes.
Counselor Hanley,
Yes.
Counselor Shipley,
Yes.
and I, Dave Sewell, will vote yes. Thank you. Let's move on to item number 3, which is a presentation regarding a plan to phase in sworn police officers to reach the desired number of FTEs needed for public safety ratios of 1.22 police officers per 1,000 residents. And this item is to be presented by Wayne Parker.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. Chief Ferguson and I have collaborated on this discussion today, and so I just wanted to let you know we've been working really hard to identify some options and ways to think about moving forward in terms of closing the gap between the number of police officers that we believe we need and the number of police officers that we have. I'm going to divert for a minute and talk a little bit about sort of the history as well as talking about ways to think about this. And I think at the end, you'll see method to my madness, maybe in terms of this presentation. So let me see if I've got, maybe, let's try it again. Well, Michael, I'm not able to control. Do you want to just advance for me? Okay, so we wanted to go back and just give you a little sense of what's happened the last several years. We went back 8 years for a variety of reasons. One of which was that these were the years that were that had the opportunity to implement some of the recommendations in what we've called the PERF report, which was done in late 2012. And so it's really the fiscal years beyond that where we started to make some changes in what we were doing, not only in terms of staffing, but also in terms of how we structure the department. And so you can see we went several years that were sort of flat in the number of officers that we added to the system, in part because we were doing more on the civilian side in terms of records management, in terms of implementing the Spillman records management system, and trying to improve efficiency. Started doing more online, more use of volunteers and other things. And so again, we were attempting to implement things that were sort of easy, low-hanging fruit in the PERF report. And then beginning in fiscal 2018, we started ratcheting up an officer or two, except in 2019 when we added 7 officers to the police department background. And so just wanted to kind of give you a sense of the statistics. Okay. So here are some ways that I'd like to have you think about staffing, and I'm going to show you a few examples. So as we've looked at the research and talked to consultants, there are basically 6 sort of ways that we think about determining appropriate levels of staffing. One, which council's looked at along the way, has been population base and growth, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The second is workload, which really has to do with what we ask our police officers to do and what resources we give them in terms of hours to do it in. The third would be around citizen satisfaction. How do our citizens feel? Do they feel safe in their homes, in their neighborhoods? And if you set certain benchmarks or criteria for citizen satisfaction and you begin to see those numbers failing, it's a good indicator that it's time to make a change. We can look at crime rates, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Minimum staffing strategy, which a number of consulting firms use, really has to do with what I would characterize as officer safety, which is at any given time during the day or during the week, how many officers do we need to have available so that all of our officers are safe? That we're not sending individual officers into a challenge because we don't have 2 of them to respond. And so minimum staffing is another strategy. And then finally, response time. And again, setting standards and evaluating based on response time. So let's get to the next slide, Michael. So population base is a pretty good indicator, but it also has some weaknesses. And I'll talk about those in a minute. There are a variety of weakness challenges. One of those is as we add civilian staff, we might actually improve our responsiveness without adding necessarily an additional officer. And so thinking, and we'll talk about some ways that we might think about doing that. It also doesn't take into account other agencies, and I'm going to show you an example of that. So, Michael, if we can move to the next slide. This one looks at our staffing per population over time. And so again, you can see back in 2014, we were about 0.88 officers per 1,000 population. And again, mirroring what we saw in the additional officer staff, we are now just about to cross the line with this year's fiscal year edition of the additional officers. We will cross the 1 officer per 1,000 line. But so this is, again, one way of looking at it. Now, I've shown this additional little bar, which I think might be interesting to you. And that is if you were to add the sworn officers in the BYU Police Department to our total. And again, there's arguments on both sides of this equation. But I think what's interesting is that when you consider that there are sworn officers covering a substantial part of at least our daytime population, and to some extent our nighttime population by residential students on campus, if you were to think this way, we're almost at 1.2 officers per 1,000. So again, I show this not to particularly make a case either way, but just to tell you that depending on how you look at staffing per population, you can reach very different outcomes. And so I just kind of wanted to share that as maybe one of the weaknesses of thinking about staffing per capita. So we go to the next slide on workload. So this was really the basis of the 2012 PERF report. PERF stands for the Police Executive Research Forum, which is a consulting firm that's a subsidiary of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And as they came in and evaluated us now almost 10 years ago, our patrol officers back then were spending about 52.5% of their time moving from one call for service to another. In addition to that, of course, there is administrative time, there's writing reports, there's booking suspects, that would be really outside of that calls for service. And so the national standard target that the PERF organization recommended was that we should shoot for 40% of our officer time being spent on responding to calls for service, taking into account, again, some of that additional administrative time, which they said could approach 15 to 20% of their day. And so that would leave, again, a substantial balance to be used in self-directed policing for officers. So this could be everything from patrolling a business park in the evening and overnight hours. It could be stopping to play basketball with a group of kids playing at a neighborhood basketball standard. It could be going to neighborhood meetings. And again, just trying to do more in terms of crime prevention and increasing, officer connectivity with the neighborhood. And so the PERF report suggested, based on that recommendation back in 2012, that we should add 14 additional patrol officers and 3 additional detectives, and that would get us to the number of 40% responding to calls for service. They also recommended some things about using more civilian staffing, and again, civilian staffing is tricky. You don't want to create expectations that civilians are sworn officers, but they could do things like go out and take reports on stolen property. They could provide support for investigators in terms of making phone calls and doing things that might relieve some of the pressure on our existing detectives. and that we focus more use on volunteers. And again, both of those things we have in part implemented since the 2012 PERF report. So again, so workload is another way of looking at it. Citizen satisfaction, again, it has been a while since we did a comprehensive citizen satisfaction survey, but we could certainly use citizen satisfaction as a measuring stick and indicate whether, again, citizens feel safe in their neighborhood. Do they see police officers frequently enough driving through the neighborhood? When they interact with us, do we respond in a way which meets their expectations? Again, we can ask a lot of those kind of really important questions. And then finally, we could also use the Citizens Advisory Board as a measure. So crime statistics is another one. We can look at specific statistics over time. And again, those are characterized by specific crimes as well as in broad groupings. And I'll show you some numbers here shortly that will give you a little indicator of crime statistics. We can also benchmark those against similar cities, and the state gathers, as well as the FBI gathers, a great amount of information around crime statistics and how those apply city to city. And then again, focus on key indicators. What are areas that you'd really like to see improvement in crime statistics? So let me just show you just a quick graph. I just went back 4 years, from 2019, which is the last full year that the FBI and the State Bureau of Criminal Investigations reported information. So you can see in Provo's reported crimes, we have made substantial improvements since 2016, but in the last 3 years, we've bounced about a bit. And again, the colors represent, the blue at the bottom is crimes against persons. The red, which you would expect to be the largest category, are crimes against property. So those would be things like theft, burglary, vandalism, graffiti, those kinds of things that impact property. And the green are what the FBI and BCI call crimes against society, which tend to be more like that would not be violent crime or resulting in maybe property value loss, but could be things like good one is misdemeanor drug charges. Again, no violence included, no destruction to property, but where it affects society in general. And so those are kind of the broad characteristics, but that gives you a sense. So if you were looking only at crime statistics, you might ask the question, we've generally been on a downward trend the last several years. We're doing a pretty good job at preventing crime, but this is certainly not the entire story. And I guess the point I'm making here is that none of these measures really represent the entire story. So let's do another one. So minimum staffing, again, in this one, and this was one that the PERF report talked a little bit about, was that we ought to consider ways to create an overlapping shift, which we've done since 2012, where we actually have a shift that hits the peak afternoon and evening hours and the peak hours before we kind of get to midnight. So kind of a swing shift approach where we actually add substantial number of officers at a time when they're most heavily needed. And so it begs questions about not only officer safety, but can we be a little more granular in terms of our staffing model so that we put officers in the places and times where they're needed the most. And then finally, response times. And again, I didn't take the time the end of last week to try to go through and gather some multiple year response time data. We certainly could do that. But again, it's another measure that I think is used pretty frequently in staffing models for police departments around the country. So that being said, let's move to the next slide. So again, I would also mention that that the police do not operate in a vacuum, and it's not in a vacuum in their own department or within the sworn officer ranks. So you can make investments in information systems, facilities, employee assistance programs, as we talked about earlier, and dispatch services, none of which are reflected in full-time police officers, but can make a substantial impact on their productivity and their morale and their ability to really deliver effective service. And so I just encourage, as we think about police staffing, that we're also thinking about support services that can really make a substantial difference in their ability to provide service. So last slide, I think it's the last slide. So again, I think as we've talked about this, I mean, we certainly looked at the 1.22 number that council's talked about, which again is sort of the Utah statewide average for officers per thousand. And again, that varies somewhat. Smaller departments often tend to have more officers per thousand because it kind of takes a critical mass to offer 24-hour shift coverage of police departments in smaller communities. And again, some cities have made the decision to staff it significantly higher than the state average. And so I think our suggestion would be that we spend a little time thinking about once we get through the budget process, and maybe it involves doing an updated staffing study, but to be thinking about what are the key indicators among these 6, and maybe it's not elements of all of them, but maybe it's elements of a few of them, that we would look at and try to decide based on good, solid data when we ought to make adjustments to the model. Now, I can tell you if we were going to model 1.22 officers and we didn't include BYU, which I think is a reasonable approach to take, we would have to add 25 officers to our pool of officers to get to 1.22 officers per 1,000 residents. And so again, these obviously aren't decisions you make lightly, and they're decisions that have consequences. As we've tried to look at future growth, it would be really good for us to get 2020 census data, because we're operating on 10 years of estimates from the state as well as from MAG and others who do population estimating. And I think we'll have that data before the end of the summer, for sure, from the state, from the U.S. Census Bureau. And so again, I think there will be a point where there will be a lot more data available to make better decisions about how we effectively staff full-time officers as well as other resources for the police department. So that sort of characterizes my presentation at the moment. We haven't yet kind of developed our strategy around adding 25 officers and when it happens. And part of that, I think, is because we think it's valuable to take a little deeper dive into the factors that would lead you to want to add officers and how fast and how frequently. So hopefully I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Mr. Hanley.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. I just want to underscore the importance of citizen satisfaction. I mean, I don't know that necessarily only gives us data that would be useful for deciding about increasing our staffing, but I think it also seems to me would be a really important tool for development of police officers and for the police chief to be able to run the department effectively, know which officers are especially effective in which kinds of work. And so in addition to a survey, has the city ever contemplated any kind of sort of feedback mechanism that's more regular, whereby citizens are asked, what was your experience like in your interaction with the officer? And then that information gets back to the officers themselves and their development efforts to help develop the kind of skills that we want our officers to have.
Yeah, so the feedback mechanisms in the police department could certainly use some more depth, I would suggest. So we clearly track complaints about interactions with our officers, and we track those by shift, by officer. We kind of have a pretty good feel for that. Our Office of Professional Standards and Training does a fair amount of data gathering from formal feedback mechanisms. The Citizens Advisory Board was originally intended to do some of that in terms of having eyes and ears out in the community to provide feedback. The citizen surveys we've done, again, as you suggested, Councillor Harding, are at least historically were annual. We have not done those for the last several years, and it's probably a best practice to consider reinstating, but we could certainly get more and better information. And then certainly individual feedback opportunities when a citizen calls us for a request for service, to send them an email or a postcard that just says, give us your candid feedback or zip onto this website and answer the questions on this survey. We could certainly do a lot more of that.
I think, yeah, it seems to me something that also sort of increases trust and sense of, everyone is in this together, and everyone's, being heard. Anyway, I think I would recommend that we consider something along those lines. I think it obviously also helps this issue, right? If we know that there's very high levels of satisfaction, but we also know that it's not just my interactions with the police officers have been really positive, but I don't see much need for them in my neighborhood, or I see them roaming our neighborhood, and that has made me feel a lot more safe. And I've noticed that there's been a decline in a certain kind of problem that they've had, or the graffiti has been reduced in this particular area of town. So I think it can give us vital data on a whole bunch of different levels.
Agreed. Thank you.
Any other?
Well, as we progress, I mean, we're fully invested in working with you to try to work through this process and figure out what our obvious best next steps are in the process. So I think that's all I have, unless you have other more specific questions.
Thank you. Mr. Strachan.
Mr. Parker, thank you for that, and it's very helpful. When I talked to the chief a few weeks ago, one of the things he suggested is that we do a new perf report, but that we wait it until we've moved into the new building, because they take into assessment the facilities that our officers are using, things like that. So, that's something we should keep in the back of our minds for next year. One of the things that when I've talked to council members and we've talked about this $176,000 credit put into the budget. Can you explain again what that means in terms of operations and staffing?
Yes. So again, the way I categorized it was, so historically, because we have not had full staffing 365 days of the year in the department, there has historically been what I would categorize as salary savings. If we've had a retirement or someone leave, and we now have to, we have to recruit, and we have to go through a selection process, and there's typically some downtime in between those things. And so as we kind of did our analysis, let me back up and say, the other thing that's traditionally happened is we have underfunded operations and overfunded staffing based on that assumption. Right. We've tried to make the budget balance, and sometimes, as opposed to affecting the manpower numbers, we have affected their operational numbers. And the department has complained, for 3 or 4 police chiefs going, that we have just not adequately funded their operational needs, their supplies, their equipment, their replacement of ballistic vests, the whole sort of O&M cost associated with the department. And so what we've traditionally done is we near the end of the year, we do some analysis on their payroll data and come back and say, well, police department, we think you have $150,000 that will remain in your budget at the end of the fiscal year. If you want to go buy some vests now, or if you want to go acquire some ammunition to put in your armory, that's probably a really good idea to try to do now, because you're going to have some surplus budget left over. And so rather than play that game, if you will, of trying to do this assessment and then figure out in a hurry what are the kinds of needs that could be met quickly, the thinking was that if we could reasonably estimate how much salary savings, based on our history, we believe the police department might have available to it, then we could actually deploy those dollars at the beginning of the fiscal year rather than the end. And so as we went through our analysis with the department and with our finance staff, we concluded that it's roughly about 2 person years of vacancy, and that's not only sworn, but it's also civilian personnel in the department. And again, we have 100 and I can't remember, John, 140 maybe total employees, full-time employees in the department. And so that's a pretty small number, of 2 FTE equivalents that we think is probably a reasonable expectation. So what we've essentially said is, we'll fund you, Chief, so if it's 130, let's say, or 140, let's say we would fund you for 138 employees. We'd authorize you to have up to 140 because that's your authorized strength. But we recognize that the reality is that you will never have 140 people in your department, full-time employees, all year long for the entire fiscal year. And so this was kind of an effort at trying to adequately fund their operations without having a negative impact on their personnel availability. So that's the concept behind what we've proposed to do in this budget. Does that help? I don't know if I clarified or muddied it, but I'm hoping I clarified it.
Does it result in the possible addition, or just in terms of timing, an extra officer, or is it really just addressing the operational needs like materials and goods and stuff?
Yes, our thinking is that it really addresses where they have felt particularly constrained in their O&M budget. And so again, we've gone in and allowed more frequent replacement of ballistic vests, better ammunition, putting effective equipment in vehicles, maybe replacing some of their tasers and those kinds of things more frequently, body-worn cameras. It's all of those kinds of things that they have felt a little bit constrained by because of perhaps overly lean operations budget.
Thanks, Wayne.
Oh, Dave Mortensen tells me it's 145 full-time police employees, so I was pretty close.
Thank you. That was a very helpful presentation. I think we all want to get it right as far as the right number of officers, but as you've explained, that's a very complex question to determine what that number should be due to all those factors. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's move on to item number 4, which is a presentation from the Carryover Committee regarding budget carryovers. And this item is to be presented by Councillor David Shipley.
Yeah, so we'll get started here in just a second. Cliff, I think you've got some slides for us. What we wanted to do today is give you some feedback on the committee. Our thought process is that the committee has done what it was charged to do at this point as far as reviewing carryovers and carryover policy here in the city. And so what we'd like to do is give you a little bit of feedback, and perhaps most importantly, get your feedback and solicit feedback from you all as a council on the one aspect of carryovers that we do expect we have some influence on and would like to discuss today, which is with excess funds. Is there a breakdown of those excess funds that makes sense? And I'll explain that more in detail in just a second. But I guess I just wanted to give you a heads up that at the end, we'd like to solicit your feedback on policy. There is a policy question to be had today. So to start, let's just go to the next slide, Cliff. One of the significant improvements over this that happened this last year is that we got a color-coded report from the administration based on, budgets, department budgets. And we get this in September, and it basically gives us an accounting for the prior year of excess funds that were carried over intra-department. And then the reason those funds were carried over in that department. So it was color-coded to help us understand where those monies went and why they went to the department in different areas. And the color coding was very helpful. I think it helped all of us understand better why money, stays in departments for different reasons. There's lots of different reasons that could potentially come up. And so that's been a significant progress point that just happened this last year. And we're happy to expect that going forward. As far as the next slide, Cliff, just to give a little bit of background on what we're actually talking about here. We all as a council, of course, approve a budget each year and spend a lot of time, as we have the past 2 or 3 months, really digging in and trying to get into the information on the proposed budget, one of the things that we don't do a lot of as a council is look back, right? And one of the ways that we look back is to look at the carryover information each fall. And one of the concerns that we had as a committee and as a council, and the reason that we formed a committee, is that a few years ago we were talking about $4 or $5 million worth of carryover dollars from the prior budget year to 2020. And so, it was just such a substantial amount, and there was not so much reporting that we felt comfortable that kind of number should be carried without, some consultation with the council. And so last year was a little bit different. Last fall was a little bit different. And so, it was a tighter year anyway because of COVID. But basically, you've got three terms that we feel are important kind of as background for what we're looking at here. One is, obviously, we're going to have things that need to be carried over. They're going to be dollars that the administration feels like a department should carry over from year to year in order to accomplish their operational needs. And that color-coded chart that we just showed you is the administration basically looking at a department's budget and saying, look, the council's already approved that budget, those dollars to go to that department. And now we're basically just approving again as an administration the idea that those funds can continue in that department for some different needs that exist. Many of those items get encumbered. And when we talk about encumbrance, we're talking about dollars that already have a PO, that already have something that they're going to. And of course, those are less, the council doesn't need to weigh in on most of those issues. They're already encumbered and they can move forward. But then there's this idea of surplus within departments that beyond what the administration allows the department to keep as far as real carryover money within their department, there's the surplus money that happens within a department sometimes because they don't spend what they intended or budgeted for in a year, or they have budget savings in a year, or personnel savings as we've talked about in terms of the police. And so these are dollars that by state law would go back to the general fund. But by ordinance, by policy, the council can weigh in on policy that would dictate that some of those funds, not all of them necessarily, go back to general fund. And so that's the policy decision that we'll discuss here in a few minutes that I think we would like to solicit feedback from the council on. So I just bring that up as something to think about before we get to that point. I will say that we wanted to make sure and give you feedback on what we've accomplished. I think the emails and notes from Cliff have done a good job with this, but I think I wanted to specifically Dave Harding to go over kind of his perspective and history on carryovers to help us all understand better from him and his perspective and experience on the council with carryovers. And I think he will do a great job. He's been a great benefit to the council. To the committee. I appreciate all his hard work and turn the time to him to give us some feedback on what we've learned.
All right. Thank you, Councilor Shipley. So this really started a few years ago when we had a carryover presentation. As you've heard, many times at the end of a presentation, we kind of say, okay, well, what's next? Are we seeing this evening? Are we seeing it in 2 weeks or whatever? And so the question was, we've got this great presentation on how we plan to use the carryover. And, so when does the council approve this? And the answer was, well, you don't approve it. This is just kind of within the purview of the administration to do this. And, that just kind of raised some questions where it seems like, pretty much everything else, the council appropriates where this seemed, that it wasn't. We looked into the state law, and the state law, actually says that surplus money in these budgets at the end of the year should fall back to the general fund. But our tradition had been to allow the administration to make these decisions on how to, or that some of this surplus money could be carried over in those department budgets into the future year. And even just, it was fairly just recent that they even reported that to the council. There had been years where it wasn't even reported. And so there were just kind of raised that question of, what is the council's role in financial oversight? We're kind of, we kind of deviated from the state default, and there could be projects that the council had never heard of, had never been presented to the council, or potentially, proposals, supplemental requests that were rejected by the council because we were funding other priorities, and now they're getting funded. And so just the big question was, what is the council's role in the fiscal oversight? We had several good conversations. We reached out to other cities. Really appreciated the conversations that we were able to have with the administration, and just upfront, just really positive discussions where we could really dig through these questions. So a couple things that we learned. Number one, we actually can direct carryover. We actually have to explicitly authorize the mayor this discretion to carry over money. We could take that out of the budget policies, and all of that money would just fall to the general fund. So that is within our ability. So we can do it, but the question is, should we do it? A point that was discussed is that departments have a wide latitude on how they spend their budget. During the supplementals, during kind of the department presentations, we get a lot of, hey, this is the money that we want to use. This is how we're going to use it. But there's nothing in the budget that says that it has to be used on the things that they that they said that they were going to use it for. And we even had a conversation, isn't that the way that we want it? Or do we really want departments coming in and saying, hey, we've used up all of our orange paper, and we need to, we want you to shift some money over from this other thing so we can buy more orange paper because we have too much purple paper, not enough orange paper. Obviously, we don't want to be in those details. So because of that flexibility, they do have to record very carefully how the money was spent, but they don't necessarily have to spend it based on what they said during the budget season. And so the concern is if we don't allow that flexibility with the carryovers, we may have a situation where departments are encumbering money at the end that they don't necessarily have to, but that way the money doesn't just fall back to the general fund. And so the way that the administration has worked out previously is that they've asked the departments not to play that game, and that the administration would consider these carryover requests at the end. So our main conclusion, or one main conclusion, is that it doesn't make sense to have tighter controls on carryover than on the intra-fiscal year spending, which is what the administration had been advocating. Can we go to the next slide? And we definitely have appreciated. Sorry, next slide. Okay. Yeah, no, actually, yeah, that's it. So we have made some good progress on the reporting that really indicates how this is being spent, and we had some really good conversations on this. And the color coding is really important, because at least to me, really, it's that orange category that we really care about. And sometimes I think if we have all of those others in there, it makes it hard to understand how much of this kind of discretionary carryover is happening, where the purple is already encumbered, or if that's blue. The green is actually things that I think we should be encouraging. And to me, that's different than this type of carryover that we're talking about. So if we go to the next slide, so some other conclusions, and I guess so this brings us back to the question of what is the council's role in fiscal oversight. Audits, we should be clear, the audits check if the money was spent or was properly recorded on what it was spent on. It does not check to see if the money was spent according to what was discussed during the budget. So it's just was it accounted for properly? Not did it follow the I guess the budget lines. So what is the council's role in the fiscal oversight? If all of these things could be spent on projects that maybe we've never heard of and projects we heard and never and rejected, what is our role here? So in discussing this further, this is kind of what we came up with. One, we should consider reviewing how the money was spent and compare that with what it was asked for. Basically, taking a look back. We should consider performance metrics when we appropriate new money, and we should consider the new requests in light of past performance. And so if we'll go back to that spiral in trying to understand, trying to think about these things, this is kind of what I had in mind to kind of help me. The current fiscal year is that yellow, and we don't know exactly how the current fiscal year is going to turn out, but we do know what the green spiral there is, which is the previous fiscal year. And so we do know what happened there, and we do know, there will be money that comes out of the previous fiscal year that gets carried over into the now current fiscal year. So there's that little arrow there, and those are the kind of the two, that and then the money that we appropriate are what go into the department budgets. We get the comprehensive audit financial report. The audit, and then the popular annual financial report come out kind of December, January timeframe. But all of that time, we have outcomes, and if we have metrics, we can then ask, how well did we hit those metrics when we had requests for this new money, and that can help us inform there on that blue part of this of the spiral, which is what we're in now when we're putting together the budget going forward, and we have some different milestones on that, with the idea that really we have to kind of keep three different fiscal years in mind as we're putting together the budget. Cliff, we could move on. We should be thoughtful. Yeah. So the next one, we should be thoughtful about the year of end of year formula, and I think that's what Councilor Shipley wants to talk more about. And then also one other idea is about before this time of the year, within as we get close to the end of the fiscal year, there's probably a decent idea of what amount of carryover we're going to have going into these department budgets. And so that might be something that we ask for that information from the administration to get a fuller picture of what the department budgets are going to be after that carryover money gets moved along. So that's one more thing that we might want to consider.
So thank you, Mr. Harding. And that graphic that he showed with the spirals, if any of you have any questions on that, I don't feel like we had near enough time to kind of consider how that could be helpful. But the bottom line is, when we're resetting the table every year on new budget proposals, I think the idea that came out of carryover was we should be reflecting on that prior year and looking at the results from that prior year, and let that help us when we're looking at proposed budgets, right? Not just resetting the table anew every single year. And I think that's what we kind of do by default, because we get out of budget mode and then we get back into it, and we allow people to just kind of set the table anew. But if we're thinking and considering and having departments really present on what they did in prior years based on our objectives and how they spent money and how effective they were, I think that will help us a lot when it comes to their current proposals for the future years. So I think we've fulfilled, I think, what the committee was intended to do, which is to review carryover policy, to have some suggestions for us as a council, which we're a committee of the whole when it comes to budget and the budget process. So this is something that kind of rests on all of us to be more cognizant of and to take more seriously about, as far as department budgets, because it's not going to be us trying to influence what the mayor and her staff does and trying to be flexible with departments when it comes to carryover. It's going to be more about what did we do when we went through the budget process and the proposed budget process in influencing what the outcome was at that point, because that's where we really have the most influence is during this budget process because once the money's allocated to a department, like Mr. Harding said, it's really there's a lot more discretion in how that department's going to spend and what they're going to do. So one of the things we want to make sure and do is, as an outcome of this, is that we are very clear that if we have intended outcomes, that we as a council consider those intended outcomes of a budget that we approve, and that we can hold a department accountable to those outcomes, and that we follow up on those outcomes. And it's not just something we forget about, and again, set the table anew every year with new ideas and with new budget. So Cliff has put in some different examples. The one I wanted to go to is just the one about the percentages real quick, Cliff, which is the one that was in last year's budget. And there'll be something to this effect in this year's budget, which is that the mayor, with excess monies each year, we pre-authorize through the budget her ability to use those funds to do something more than just have it all revert to general fund. And the thinking in the past, and Wayne, you can help correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the thinking in the past, or the perspective, was we wanted to incentivize departments to have something to look forward to if they actually did have excess funds, right? And tried to have savings throughout a year. And so the idea is that we as a council could discuss today and maybe just take a few minutes to see if anybody has input on this idea of the mayors in the past having discretion to take 50% and put it in something like employee recognition and innovation, as opposed to just having the full balance go directly back to general fund. And I think it was the previous slide, Cliff, if I'm not mistaken, that had that example from the previous year. Yeah, this one. And so the idea is going forward that if the council had a suggestion on this or something that they really wanted to see from carryover excess, then I think we should look at it. So one of the things we had talked about it in committee is that if we said something like, okay, maybe we fund innovation and recognition up to a dollar amount based on surplus, but then after that dollar amount, maybe all the funds get split, for example, between the general fund and say something like the disaster fund, which is a new fund that we're able to fund each year and to add monies to, something that we don't yet have at this point. That something like that may make sense to try to fund through carryover excess. And so I wanted to get feedback from any of you all as counselors to see if you guys have ideas for other things that maybe should be considered as priorities that could be funded through carryover and put into ordinance within the budget, so that we could have it be something that the mayor and the administration are looking at as they start to review carryover excess this year.
Dave, this is Cliff. If I could just take a couple minutes to show you some examples of what we put in these slides. I will say that we have planned to actually have a discussion on Tuesday, June 1st, when we have the proposed resolution to talk about some of these, but we wanted to leave council members with some thinking about some of the possibilities, as Dave has mentioned. This slide right here has pulled a paragraph right out of the draft budget resolution, and it captures some of the things that Dave has talked about. It doesn't distinguish between, it says money goes into the employee recognition fund program and innovation fund to a total of $400,000, but it does not determine, for example, how much goes into either in this. And this is the language that came from the administration in the current draft. And just flip back a couple slides. This is where we started this year. And even this has changed a little bit from a couple of years ago when we first started having this discussion. terms of, there's some more legislative intent. This is also partly because of the discussions that we've been having the last year and a half on carryover. It comes from the administration. It clarifies what information will be appropriated or be reported. Let me show you a couple other things. This is, you've heard this already in discussion, where this is a proposed intent statement to basically create a recreation facilities capital fund. And one of the things that's interesting on here is that it combines both formulas, such as 25% of revenues. It also has a cap on certain amounts where the funds come. And if you look at the very bottom of the slide, it says this language has also been added to the principles of financial management in the budget document. So let me just back up a couple slides to legislative intent. And it says here that I borrowed from the state their definition of legislative intent, and it's a statement adopted by the governing body, that is the council, to explain or place conditions on the use of funds. And it typically just applies to the year that it applies to. And if you want to do something longer term, you've got to either put it in the code, or you got to put it in the principles of financial management. And those policies are already listed in the principles of financial management as something that the council reviews and approves each year with the budget document. So part of our review every year, and we'll do this for the next meeting as well, is just take a look at the principles of financial management and see if anything's been changed, and consider whether anything should be changed. Another example. Sorry, I'm skipping around here. Another example to consider, back in April of 2020, the council adopted an alternative fuels vehicle policy, and we put it in our handbook, but we also put an excerpt by design into the principles of financial management. That's the blue part highlighted. So as you think, as council members, as you think about things that you might want to change, or you might want to focus your desires to put money in certain funds, think about not only whether it applies to this year, but whether it applies to future years. And then think formulaically, if I can say that, about how you want to do these funds, and always remember that you need to have some flexibility in things, because circumstances change over time. And I think that when we've talked in these discussions with the administration, they're looking for flexibility. We're looking for a little bit of programming. Where is that balance? And so it's an ongoing discussion. And our plan is to have this in front of you next week and talk about these particular clauses, if you will.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I don't know if you can go back to the slides with the text. Is the question, do we want to update our budget ordinance to reflect this proposed policy on surplus spending in individual departments? Is that the question?
The question that we'll be reviewing next time, if I may answer that, is just whether or not we should change. Yeah, sorry, the slide that was just up. Whether or not we should influence the slide that was just up, which is when there's surplus, right? When there's overall surplus, is there some programming that we think is high enough priority that it actually should be added to this this language? And is 400,000 between innovation and recognition the right number of a cap of some kind? When we had talked in committee, we thought, maybe that number is like 100 or 200. Most budgets, most departmental budgets within the city already have recognition built into them. So innovation needs funding each year. Carryover is its primary source of funding, but recognition is going to happen regardless of whether or not there's excess or not. The idea was it motivates departments to actually return some money, in surplus if they can use some of it. But my thought is that adding something like the disaster fund, which is a new opportunity, makes sense to integrate in some way as well.
Okay. The only thing I would propose adding to this, I like the employee recognition program and the innovation fund. It may be that there's not a lot of opportunities for innovation in accounting or in certain departments. I would be interested in adding here, like employee professional training or personal development. Unless we think that's appropriate for a different area. But I feel like that shows that we're reinvesting like these two do, like employee recognition and the innovation fund, we're reinvesting in individuals.
And Wayne, maybe you can speak to this, but I think recognition historically has encompassed more than just what we traditionally think is recognition. But Wayne, I'd defer to you.
Sure, thank you. So we do provide in every operating budget money for employee recognition, which is designed to be sort of the one-time recognition of an employee doing something pretty remarkable. We also have employee appreciation, which is more, do we get together for lunch occasionally to celebrate something? And so those are two different sets within our operating budgets. What the mayor's employee recognition program has done historically has really been, the major focus at the outset was recognizing employees in one department who serve the needs of those in another department. So a good example of that is when the fire department was doing their temporary facility up on North Canyon Road, and they asked Public Works to come in and help them with some paving so that they could park their fire truck under the fabric material. Obviously, the budget paid for the asphalt. What it didn't pay for was the employees doing it so quickly and so timely. And so then a department can make a request from the mayor's employee recognition fund to recognize someone in another department. And that was, again, designed to break down silos and try to help reinforce that. There's also been occasions when an employee has really stepped up way above and beyond the call of duty, and a director may say, boy, I would really like to recognize this employee, but it's a one-off. My employee recognition program probably can't support it. Mayor, could you help us with that? And then we've done a bonus, for example, for an employee. And so again, it's been relatively modestly used. We've also used it. I should mention too, as we sort of integrated the innovation fund with this, employees who submit successful innovation fund projects also get a little small bonus. I think it was $500 this year if they submitted one that actually got funded. And so again, these are just ways that we try to encourage the kinds of behavior out of employees we want, but they tend to be more global than they are departmental. Does that make sense?
And I was just going to thank you, Wayne, for clarifying. I was just going to say to Shannon's point, I think when there is savings, when it goes into the recognition fund or when it goes into innovation, this is for citywide. This is citywide innovation. This is citywide recognition. It's not necessarily for the department that experienced the savings.
Right.
And I would just add, I think that I hope that we are adequately serving employees with professional development needs and education needs, continuing education needs, right? Sometimes you have to go to these conferences, and that's where you can get your continuing education credits. And if we're not paying for that and supporting that, then we should be. And this could be a good way to reinvest in employees if it can't be found elsewhere.
If I could address that. So with the city, and Wayne knows the program better than I do because we haven't accessed it from the council office, but there is a budget that exists for employees that are doing, say university degrees that under certain circumstances can access those funds, and there's a committee that meets to do that. But typically, most departments have a fair amount, and some more than others. And as you can see in the supplemental request, there's some that want to top theirs up a little bit. But generally, every department has training dollars to help with professional development, and that probably differs. It does differ by department depending on what their needs and priorities have been.
Counselors, I just wanted to mention that we're about 25 minutes behind schedule. I don't know how long you want to be here tonight, but I'm wondering maybe if we should continue this discussion. I think we already have set aside time for it at our next meeting, haven't we, Mr. Strachan?
Yeah, to that, would I add just, counselors, if you have suggestions, ideas of possible changes that you would want to legislative intent of any kind, send those to me by email, and we'll talk about it at leadership on Thursday, and that'll help us kind of program what discussion we might want to have on Tuesday the 1st.
Sounds good. Mr. Harding?
Thank you. I appreciate it. Just the thought that I have is I think this would be I think we should talk about a budget for, a bucket of for this kind of employee appreciation, recognition, training, innovation, all that, and then let the administration figure out like the best way to use that, and recommend that rather than trying to pinpoint what we think it should be.
All right, thank you. Let's move on then, if that's all right, to item number 5. And we'll look forward to continuation of this discussion. By the way, very nice work from the Carryover Committee. I think we're going to have some robust discussion about this. So item number 5 is a presentation regarding transfers from all the different utility funds to the general fund for fiscal year 2022. And this is to be presented by David Mortensen.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. So I apologize for the, presentation style I'm about to give. It's probably not the most engaging style. What I want to do is just read the notice that we send out to utility customers in the city, because I think it best describes the transfers better than I could summarize. So bear with me while I read this, and hopefully it's not too bad. But so state law requires that Provo City provide an annual disclosure of funds transferred from the utility enterprise funds to other funds. So just a side note, this includes transfers to other funds besides just the general fund, but definitely we'll talk about general fund as well. The following paragraphs explain the various transfers from enterprise funds to other funds in the proposed 2022 budget. Historically, Provo has budgeted for the transfer of 10% of utility fund revenues to the general fund as a dividend to Provo taxpayers as the result of the taxpayers' investment in the city's utility infrastructure. These funds are used each year to help cover the costs of important city services like police, fire, parks, and recreation, and other city functions. The utility transfer, together with franchise fees, helps keep property taxes in Provo low. If city utility services were provided by private utility owners, these dividends would instead be paid to investor owners. Because Provo taxpayers are the investor owners, these dividends are used to offset what otherwise would be a significant increase in property tax rates. The 10% transfer totals $11,907,231 in the proposed 2022 budget. Since 2013, a 1% transfer from utility fund revenues has been transferred to the general fund to be used to enhance available funding for road maintenance. The 2022 budget proposes that $1,190,723 be transferred to the general fund. It is more cost-effective and operationally efficient for certain administrative functions such as legal, human resources, information technology, and finance to be administered on a citywide basis. Transfers from the funds receiving the benefit of these administrative services to the general fund totaling $1,258,504 have been included in the proposed 2022 budget. A resolution was passed on November 15th, 2011, allowing for an energy rate increase for telecom debt service fee. These fees provide funding for telecom debt service payments. The transfer to the telecom debt service fund totals $3,250,000 in the proposed 2022 budget. Provo City is in the process of implementing a citywide system known as Provo 360. The system will benefit residents, customers, and all departments of the city. The proposed 2022 budget includes transfers of $894,190 to the Provo 360 fund. A transfer of $583,820 from the wastewater fund to the water fund has been included in the 2022 proposed budget. The transfer is a reimbursement for management services provided to the wastewater fund by the water fund. The following table outlines the transfers described above. So maybe you can zoom in a little bit on that, so it's easier to see. hopefully that's readable. So basically the table is just a summary of what was described above, showing broken out by type of transfer, where the transfer is coming from, where it's going to. So you see there the 10% transfer from utility funds to the general fund, the 1% transfer that's related to roads that comes to the general fund, the administrative overhead charge, the telecom debt service, the Provo 360 transfers, and then that transfer from water to wastewater, or from wastewater to water, and then the totals for each of those. And then the far right column shows a percentage of that particular fund's total revenues. A little bit. So then after the chart, I think we're good at this point. After the chart, the language in the notice, there we go. The language in the notice just below it talks about the requirement for public hearing. So the notice that residents received has information on how they can attend either in person or via Zoom or via telephone, attend the public hearing that will be held next Tuesday evening regarding sorry, it won't be next Tuesday evening. June 15th is the public hearing for transfers. So this one requires just one public hearing. It's held on the 15th, the same night that we'll have our final public hearing and adoption of the budget, where interested residents can comment on the proposed transfers, and council can respond to those comments. So with that, I'll answer any questions that the council may have about transfers.
Any questions for Mr. Mortensen? All right, seeing none, well, thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the upcoming discussion in the public meeting about that. Thanks for helping us get back a little closer on track here too. Move on to item number 6, which is a presentation on the fiscal year 2022 supplemental budget request submitted by various departments. And this is to be presented by Cliff Strachan, Council Executive Director, and David Mortensen, Budget Officer.
Okay. David and I are going to tag team a little bit, but we didn't really discuss how we're going to tag team. So I think what we'll do is I will go over what I had intended to show you, and Dave can answer all the questions. How's that work, Dave? I had already emailed this document out to you, but since then I've gone through and I've played with it a bit to isolate different items, and I'm going to share the screen with you. And forgive me if it doesn't share well because of size, but I wanted to give you an indication of some of the ways of looking at this document. You have seen this before, and this is the full list of supplementals. 4 items have been added. Dave can explain what those are for you if you desire to know, and I'm sure you are. But what I've done is I've just, again, I've got to figure out how to do it from this small screen onto the big one, but it's a full list of all. If you look down here, there's a long list of things that were unfunded this year just because there's more asks than dollars. And what I'm going to show you is administration funded things to the extent that they felt were priorities and how they could afford them. This is a list of general fund, mostly general fund, but this is the critical needs that were funded. And you can see that a number of these were fulfilled, but there's still a lot to be addressed in terms of critical needs. The color coding I've put on here, is just rough based on some of the things that the council had listed in its priorities. You would have liked to have seen more money put aside for, I think you've addressed partly this parking enforcement officers a little while ago. I know there's talk about using one-time money for a sustainability plan. There was an ask to restore monies for various operational things. I don't think this membership dues and subscriptions had been cut, but there's an ask to put those in. Talked about training and travel budgets. Code compliance was concerned about branding and training. And then there's some changes to be made in CNS. Now, none of these items were funded, but they were critical needs that were listed. What I've done is the same exercise with necessary items in terms of the categorizations. They were categorized as critical, necessary, and aspirational, the three categories I recall. And nothing from the aspirational was funded, but a number of things from the necessary and critical. And again, there's just being short on funds. There's only so many things that can be funded. Now, these one-time items that I've listed in the highlighted over here pertain to some of those council priorities that you would like to do. And then I'll get to you in just a minute, Councilor Ellsworth. And then this is a list of one-time monies that are items that were unfunded from that list. In other words, these are the only items on that entire list that were listed as one-time monies. And as you consider things like the legacy CIP fund, future use of ARPA, even I've highlighted this carryover. One of the questions I have is how many of these things will be able to be addressed by carryover money sometime this year? And that's a question I've heard other councilors ask. But I wanted to show you that and just give you an idea of what the picture looks like if you were to try and find other monies for other things. And in the next discussion after this, we'll talk about what kind of things you want us to focus on next. But I think we can take questions. David Mortensen, did you have anything you wanted to add, or do you want to let Shannon ask her question?
Yeah, really quick. I just wanted to add, you mentioned some additions to the list since the last time we presented it. So those all involve fire. One of them I mentioned earlier in my presentation about revenues because it does involve the use of ARPA revenues, and that is the Public Safety Behavioral Health Services. So that is a request of $85,000 that we are recommending be included in the budget. The other three, just to give you a really brief rundown of what they are, one of them was overtime in the airport. They feel like they need some additional funds there to be able to provide that service at the airport that for the level of service that's required of them. And then in the dispatch area, they're requesting, it's called Pro QA Medical Interrogation System. This has been a request in the past. It's basically just a system that helps the telecommunication employees to go through a checklist of questions and how to kind of flow through a call using prompts and just an improved system from what they're currently using. And then the final one is an upgraded fire alerting system. That's the largest of the requests. It's $322,000. It is a one-time funding request. And I would have to look more into the details of that if you had questions about exactly what it was. But it was just labeled as in their operations, an upgraded fire alerting system.
Okay. Councilor Ellsworth, you had a question for us?
Yeah, I'm curious how you determine something is necessary versus critical.
So those, we rely on the department heads that submit the supplemental request to designate that priority. We don't go through and change any of those. So it's just dependent on the department and how critical or necessary they feel that particular request is.
I had a question about the code compliance, the staff uniforms and equipment, the branding, and the continuing education. In our original budget intent statement, the branding, I'm pretty sure was mentioned, and maybe the education, I can't remember on that one. Can we bring that up?
I can't pull it up. I'd have to go search for it. But what you asked for as a council was, you had talked about couple areas here. You talked about improving zoning enforcement, effectiveness, efficiency, and retention in that department by implementing recommendations from the council zoning committee to restore the department to its previously budget level, 6 full-time officers, creating a full-time supervisory position among those, and providing funds for department branding and educational opportunities.
Yeah, so in my view, I think we've already asked for the branding and the continuing education component on there.
Yeah, you've asked for them, but the funding's not there from my understanding of this, and it's not one-time income. But so the question is, I think this is the question we asked finance to look at when they talk about revenues is, there's always two ways to fund these things, and one is to have additional revenues, and one is to cut other expenditures. And so there's always that balancing act that you have to figure out in order to have a structurally sound budget. And how do we get there?
Councillor Hanley?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a clarification on the sustainability plan. I had a preliminary conversation with Gary McGinn about the funding for that after he had spoken with Wayne Parker and Travis Ball, I believe. And so they're proposing $40,000 to come from Provo Power from the renewable energy credit money, and then an additional $20,000 that would come from the administration, but I can't remember if it was carryover or what it was. And they were asking if the council could come up with the additional $20,000. It was $75,000 plus, I think, $4,000 and change related to the plan. So anyway, I just wanted to explain why that says 60,000 instead of 80. And we, don't have to decide exactly where that 80,000 comes from, if it comes from our own carryover or from the legacy funds that we still have to allocate. But that was their proposal, and that's why it's that amount.
Mr. Harney?
Thank you, Chair Sewell. I'm just thinking maybe I should just ask the administration to respond, but let me just kind of throw out the way that I think about the budget process and how we got to this point. Earlier we listed kind of some priorities that we would like to see addressed in the budget, and the administration, looking at all of the forecasts and balancing, the different requests or whatever, they kind of come up with their best proposal, to try to balance all of these various things, and that's what we have before us. And then, the council is the body that actually has to adopt the budget. And so, if there's parts where we feel like we want adjustments to that, then we need to make it known or to make requests for those to be made as we move forward. And then at some point, we either pass it or we don't. But anyway, so I guess the point is even though that we put that in earlier, I think that if we actually want, if the tentative budget doesn't meet, our expectations in that area, we can ask for changes to be made. But we also may be asked, like, okay, if we're going to put money into that, we need to find a place that we reduce that. And so I think if we do make that request, like, please fund this, we probably need to also instruct where we would like to see that money taken from, or just say, please do your best to try to move things around so we can get that and see what they come back with.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Mr. Strachan?
I think just in terms of practical, in the practicality of running any department, while these asks are critical and necessary, and we have different reasons for wanting to add those to our budget and have that ability to fund those things, Nothing, I won't say nothing, but there is little to stop a department head if they want to find a way to include these expenditures in their budgets, given the authority they have within their departments to do that. But then they make those decisions on a as needed basis or however they want to view that. I think we've had one police chief had made some changes in his personnel to create a sworn officer position. So in the short term, sometimes directors can find the way to cover these costs within their existing budget, but they always have to decide what they're not going to do or what they're going to give up to do that. And during the carryover process, that might be a really good way of addressing some of these one-time things, or at least in the 1 year at a time, dealing with some of the ongoing things that haven't been fully funded. So there's that flexibility to do those things, but it is challenging. And as a department head myself, it's always nice to have the ability to do that, but it's always also nice to have the actual funds to do everything you're trying to do.
Any questions or comments? Mr. Strachan.
So I will leave it to you as same invitation I made on the intent statements is if you have something you want to pursue, be clear about it. Let us talk about it and see if there's ways for us to try and address it with either department heads or within the budget. But I think Mr. Harding captured it well, that you have to decide if you want to fund this, and you've got to decide what to unfund or ask departments to say, hey, I'll give you I can authorize you to spend it on this, but I can't give you the extra $7,000 you want or something like that. So there is that flexibility, but adds any, at this point with revenue limitations, any ads require a deduction. So just send me information if you have anything. And
okay. We'll
also work on that sustainability thing, George, and figure out the timing of that and how that will work in practical sense.
So if I could just follow up on that, I would like to see those two items included in the final adopted budget. I feel like we asked for them originally. And my preference would be for the administration to figure out what would need to be adjusted to make that happen. I mean, if they come to us with a budget that doesn't include that, then I guess then it would fall on us to make the adjustment. But I think they're in a much better position to make those kind of detailed.
Mr. Sewell, are you asking for the two that I'm thinking you're talking about is the staff uniforms and equipment and the code compliance continuing education budget?
Yes, that would be
okay.
My
that's
request.
A total of $21,250 between them.
Pardon?
That's $21,250 between them. And so, do you want that to be a motion, or do you want them just to see if they can do it voluntarily right now?
Well, if the administration is willing to, like I said, I feel like we already asked for that, but I guess if we need to, we could do another motion. But who do I ask on that? Mayor Wayne, how would you?
Yeah, so just the fact that we know now, so Dave Mortensen and John Borgett will get to work on it, and they'll see what they can find, and then they'll come and present it to me, and we'll see if we can make this happen. Anything else, Dave, that I need to add?
No, I think that's it.
Oh, sorry, you're talking to the other Dave.
I didn't know which Dave. I thought maybe it was me.
I forget we have multiple Daves.
All right, so maybe we can address that after the administration has taken another look, and because presumably you can make adjustments or recommendations before we vote on the first.
Yeah, you can make adjustments right up until final adoption. And then if you make changes after that, it's a whole amendment to the budget. But yeah, so I would say to you is let them have a chance to look at it and report back on June 1st and whether or not they think they can do it. And
sounds good
there. So we'll put we'll put a little section in the work meeting to talk about any budget changes that have come from these discussions, and then go from there.
Sounds good. Sound good to you, Mayor and Wayne? Okay, thank you. Anything else on this item? All right, thank you. Let's move on to our final item then, which is a discussion regarding next steps in adopting the fiscal year 2022 Provo City Budget. And this item is to be presented by Cliff Strachan.
Okay. I have no actual documents to share with you, no slides or anything on this one. Really, this is a chance, as we've talked about things, every meeting we've had, we've made more progress towards the final budget. We've had a couple asks here that we're going to work on and see what we can do about getting them in. We've had there's still I think the outstanding question about additional police officers and how to address that. I did circulate an email to the council a little while back talking about some possible ways of doing that. We're doing a separate review of, the airport public safety issues and how we might address that. And fortunately, we have time to figure that out. But in the shorter term, if council wants another 1 or 2 officers, it's apparent from our revenue sources and such that we don't think we have the funds to do that. So the next step there is does the council want to consider the possibility of a property tax increase to do that? And if you're interested in that, we'll come back on Tuesday with some numbers for you and show you what that might look like. The rough numbers that I put together based on the cost of a police officer and their attendant expenses worked out by my estimation to about $3.80 on a property worth $400,000 per year. So it's not huge, but the question is, the council will have to consider by June 15th is, do you want to go down that road? And if you do, then you have to entertain a public hearing of truth and taxation sometime before September 1st to make that decision. But we'll present you a little bit of information on that, so you at least have that information in front of you. And so really the next part of this discussion I wanted to have with you is simply, as we move into June 1st, we've addressed a lot of issues. Are there other items pertaining to the budget that you want to hear about specifically in work session before you actually consider the first public hearing on the proposed budget?
Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you can repeat that, Cliff. It was $3 and something annually per officer. Can you tell us those numbers again?
Yeah, it's less than $4 on a $400,000 house. That's if my estimate per officer.
Okay.
I'm going to work on that with David Mortensen and get the more up-to-date numbers on things, but that was just a back of the envelope calculation a couple of weeks ago. And we still don't have the final numbers on what this year's budget tax rates are going to be and stuff, but we'll use last year's to figure that out and come to you with an estimate if we haven't got the final stuff. And my discussion with Dave Mortensen was we probably won't have the final property tax rate numbers until our June 15th meeting.
I believe Councillor Ellsworth asked for clarification on whether that was an annual number.
Yes,
it is. Okay, thank you. Mr. Hardy.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. I'll try to be quick about this. I wasn't planning to talk about this, but just the question of property tax increases is something that we've discussed over some years. I look to Wayne or others if they want to correct if I misspeak, but and Chair Sewell, you've been here longer than I have, and we have worked on this together on some of these aspects together. But if I'm not mistaken, it's probably been, I think we've increased the property tax rate once in like the last 30 years. And I think it was 2012. I'll have to check that. Was the one time that we did it in 30 years. So in 30 years, I think it was done once. And I actually think that that the rate actually went down that year, but just not as much as it does by default. So there was an adjustment, but it still went down, and that's because of the way that the state of Utah requires that property tax rates be set. And it basically is designed to take out the appreciation that naturally occurs, and the appreciation of property tax values is at least somewhat tied with inflation, or not tied with inflation, but also includes a component that is due to inflation. And if you look at the actual buying power, the effective rate, it really has reduced by half. And this is 5 years ago or 4 years ago, by about half what it used to be to what it is now. And so there has kind of been this continual erosion over 30 years of the buying power of the property taxes that we collect, and that property tax rate has decreased in real numbers. It actually decreases. So 5 or so years ago, that the council passed a intent statement that we were going to increase. We were going to make a property tax adjustment, not to offset the appreciation of real property in the city, but to offset the inflation in the city. And so we and I think that was unanimously passed by the council. The council said we were going to do this, and then just months later, when we were in this position, we didn't have the votes to actually implement even the first of those inflation adjustments. And the idea is we would rather keep things sustainable and have small increases, and they're not even increases, they really are just adjustments that keep it from going down as much as it would otherwise go down. But do that every year rather than waiting until it gets to such a crisis moment that we have to make some large adjustments. And we've seen this with our utility rates. So I think there is a strong argument for doing an inflation adjustment, and we maybe even doing, not just doing it for this past year, but an inflation adjustment for multiple years. And that, Mr. Schrecken, might be something that would be interesting. We know what the dollar amount would be, but what would the rate amount, and how does that compare to the inflation? My guess is, even if we just do 1 year worth of inflation adjustment, it might be sufficient to cover the cost of a police officer. So that might be something to look into. But we should also be aware that the flip side, that the argument against doing this property tax inflation adjustment, we have seen a remarkable increase in our sales tax. I think that's both through our efforts to grow our in-city retail, but that's also just reflects the new reality that internet sales are now being taxed. And so we have seen this increase in city revenues. And if that's the case, do we really need to adjust for inflation, or do we just look at this as a tax cut on our property taxes for our residents? So we could look at it that way. The other argument against is because of, and I'll come out and say that I think it was fiscal irresponsibility that we allowed our utility rates to not keep up with the cost of providing those services. And for decades and decades, we let them, the buying power of our utility rates stay stagnant. And we had these huge infrastructure debts that we needed to pay off. And it has been very painful on our residents to watch and to experience these very large utility rate increases. And so we've seen that over the last several years, 7 or so years, we've had that. And because of the transfers that we talked about earlier, our general fund is being replenished greater than it was before through these utility rate transfers on these increases. And so a good argument could be made that a property tax inflation adjustment is not needed because we have seen these increases revenues through our utility rates. And that was kind of the whole point of having these transfers, is to keep our property taxes low. So that would be the argument, I think, against doing a property tax increase.
Yeah. And we would show you a bunch of information on that, and it's your choice. We at the end of the day, all we're trying to show you is here's a possible source if you want to do it. 5 years ago, I think it was, we did it. I think we identified off the top of my head, I think we figured out it was about a 1% increase to get one officer. And at the time the council decided not to, and they decided not to because the feeling was that only about 50% of the city is receiving or paying property taxes. BYU was making a contribution, and that the council of the day felt very strongly that since we have the utility rates do apply to everyone, that was the way to do it. And so there's ups and downs on all of it, but we'll show it to you some information as just as one option, and let you talk about it and decide whatever you want to do. That's what we're here for. Any other suggested items you want to hear about next week?
Councillor Hanley.
Well, this is just a comment, follow up on Mr. Harding's comments. I think one of the downsides, I mean, I have appreciated the 11%, I think it is, from energy. But I do feel like we're over dependent on that resource. I don't know what other ways the energy would like to spend that money, but I would be interested to know if there's a way to I just explore the possibility of reducing that dependency. I mean, one of the downsides is that it still remains very economically difficult for us to help people who want to produce their own energy through solar panels. We sort of make it hard for them, almost incentivize them to use more energy than they need so that they don't overproduce. And because if they overproduce, we can't really reward them appropriately because of that utility transfer. Anyway, I don't know that that's a game breaker for everything else. It's just another factor that has always concerned me and makes me wonder if our dependence on that money is in the long-term interest of the city, even though I don't really know what the alternative would be other than, a property tax increase on 50% of the population, which I think is an uncomfortable thing. Although I think Mr. Harding's point, I just want to underscore, for our public schools, essentially every year they're losing money, because they're still having to meet the cost of living in their expenses, and yet our property tax is staying kind of steady, and that buying power is decreased over time, and I think that's a pity.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I'm curious where's this number coming that 50% of the city would experience a property tax increase, but 50% wouldn't?
That was the information we had 4 or 5 years ago when we last looked at it, that the property tax base, it's a rough number, but it's about 50% of the city is residential commercial. Everything else is, there's church property, BYU property, there's county property, state property, city property. All of those items are non-taxable.
Okay, so only 50% of the landmass of Provo is
correct
in a taxable zone. Okay.
Yeah, and so I would actually suggest that we not have this debate here right now, because we want to give you the information, and at the end of the day, you can choose one way or the other, and we're just here to give you that information. But again, really what I'm asking for is there other things you want to hear about before you consider the first public hearing on the budget? And the same offer goes. If you come up with something between now and Thursday morning, let me know and we'll raise it with leadership.
Well, maybe getting back to the police officers for a second. So property tax was mentioned as one potential vehicle, but there's also ARP to consider for that. And I know we don't want to overuse that for one-time expenditures, but it is designed, one of the purposes is to provide for essential workers. So we could potentially use that for a year or even 2 years to provide an extra officer until our revenue base grows to the point where it could support it organically.
Yeah, if you do that, and that is true, and if you do that, then you have to consider one of your financial policies, which is to have a structurally sound budget, and you would actually be now funding ongoing expenses with one time. And sometimes you do that in a pinch, but ideally you want to be doing it in a structurally sound manner and as part of your financial policy. So I think we can look at that and have that discussion. But just consider that that's already one of the statements you have in your thing, and we're committed to try and help you find ways to fund additional officers if we can. But at the end of the day, it's a decision between the council and the mayor.
Mr. Borget?
Yeah, my understanding from the discussions that I've been involved with, wouldn't be able to do that unless you can show that officer's primary responsibility would be COVID related, or you can show that position was cut as a result of COVID. And so I think it would be a difficult argument and task to fund a new police officer with that money.
Well, thank you. That's a helpful clarification. Councilor Ellsworth?
Yeah, I was just thinking it would be helpful if staff or the administration could help us, could take the council intent budget statement and highlight in the budget where that's being fulfilled.
I'm not understanding the question.
The council created and voted on a budget intent statement. I think there were 4 or 5 priorities there. Can the staff or the administration show us where that's being met, where our priorities are being met in the proposed budget?
Here.
Sorry?
Yeah, I think we did that, Councilor Ellsworth, on May 11th. I sent you I sent out to council a memo that summarized all of the budget items in there compared to council priorities. Now we could update that based on additional items that we've discussed up till tonight. But in the last, 2 weeks ago, we had that information out to all the council members in a memo. And I'll get that back out to you.
Thanks.
Anything else, councilors, before we go at it again next week? All right, if there's no objection, then we'll adjourn by unanimous consent and see you in a week. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.